Welcome to the Food Revolution Summit, where we explore how you can heal your body and your world with food. I'm Ocean Robbins, and I'm honored to be here with our guest today. The interview you're about to watch is with Dr. Susan Peirce-Thompson. Susan Peirce-Thompson, PhD, went from a drug-addicted teenager to a food-addicted young woman. In a quest to reclaim her life, she got clean, stopped eating sugar and flour, and went from size 16 to size 4. Now, as a professor of brain and cognitive sciences, president of the Institute for Sustainable Weight Loss, and CEO of Bright Line Eating, Susan and her team are on a mission to help 1 million people achieve long-term sustainable weight loss by 2030. Susan's program, Bright Line Eating, utilizes cutting-edge research to explain how the brain blocks weight loss. Every day, she teaches people how to undo that damage so they can lose excess weight and truly find peace with food. She's the author of multiple New York Times best-selling books, including the landmark Bright Line Eating. Her latest book is on This Bright Day, a year of reflections for lasting food freedom. In the interview you're about to watch, we're going to be talking with Susan about food freedom, about food addiction, about what really works for weight loss and what doesn't, about the latest breakthrough weight loss drugs and whether they're good or bad, and so much more. Susan, welcome.
Thank you, Ocean. So good to be here.
You wrote Bright Line Eating, and you're an expert on the psychology of eating and food and fat and weight. And so, we live in a society where almost 70% of our population is now overweight or obese. Can you talk about this and how we got here?
In short, we don't have brains or bodies that were designed for food abundance, right? If you just go back any significant length of time, I don't know if anyone's done this thought experiment like really deeply. What would it be like to live in the climate I live in, 20,000 years ago, and to actually try to survive? Like, the getting of enough food would have been absolutely the dominant pursuit of every practically waking moment of every day. Food scarcity is what we are designed to handle from a brain and a body perspective. So now, as we've industrialized and moved into cities and, developed big agribusiness and learned how to process foods and transport foods, we now live in this world of shocking food abundance, and our brains and bodies were not equipped to handle it. That resulted in some amount of weight gain, but really what took it to the next level was the mega processing of hyper palatable foods and the deliberate manufacturing of foods by big food companies to make them ever more addictive. The companies started in, the 80s and 90s and 2000s using the techniques they'd used to get people hooked on cigarettes to make food products that would make us not be able to stop eating them. They even said that in their commercials, right? You can't eat just one. So that's what drove our weight out of control.
We live in a culture where there's a lot of fat shaming, where a lot of people feel ashamed and guilty, and self-judgment and self-hate, especially young women and girls. You're a mom with 3 youngsters in female bodies that are dealing with this. Can you talk a little bit about the impact on human psyches of growing up in a body that is carrying excess pounds in the culture that we live in today?
It's so ironic in our current culture. Carrying excess weight is stigmatized and shamed, when if you think about it, it's a very adaptive state of being. To have a body that readily and easily packs on extra pounds means you're living in a body that is supremely adapted for an environment where there's going to be a significant food shortage through the winter. It reminds me a little bit of the way it's hard to be addictive in our current society, to have a brain that's hyper-tuned to the cues that predict rewards. People with brains like that are also, powerfully driven into their phones and one-clicking on Amazon and addicted to food and to coffee and to alcohol and all these cigarettes and all these things. Whereas back in the day, we would have just been the ones in the tribe who were the ones who knew when the rain was going to come and what that rattle in the bush meant, that there was a snake there, because we knew the cues that predicted certain things. So anyway, we live in a society now where it feels like a failure to carry excess weight. And unfortunately, the reality is that certain bodies just pack on extra pounds. That's what they do. And other bodies resist those excess pounds. And a lot of my work as someone who does have a body that is more prone to carrying excess weight, and I was living with clinical obesity by my mid-20s, I know acutely and profoundly the psychological burden of not being able to control my eating, not being able to control my weight, feeling like I could succeed at everything in life, including, being happily married and getting a PhD and running a marathon, and I couldn't handle my weight. I think for a lot of people, it feels like you're failing at life if you can't manage your weight. Unfortunately, the lengths you have to go to manage your weight if you live in a body that is predisposed to packing on weight, the lengths are great in this current food culture. I say that food is the hardest addiction to kick. And I've been hooked on crack cocaine and crystal meth. Food is harder. So basically, in a nutshell, it's profoundly psychologically difficult.
Take us inside that experience. Like, for so many people, it is a repeated experience to feel out of control in relationship to food. And someone who's never been there doesn't understand what that's like.
That's right.
They're just like, oh, they don't have willpower. Right. They're just slovenly, lazy, don't care about themselves or the world, right? But actually, for somebody who's actually been there, it's not lazy at all. It's something else. Can you tell us about that experience?
Yeah, what happens when you have a brain that gets pulled in by food is that your brain gets hijacked by processed foods, sugar, flour, processed fats. These foods in combination, they pull your brain beyond reason, and they rewire your brain through dopamine downregulation and leptin resistance to produce insatiable hunger and overpowering cravings. And what happens then is you lose control over how much you eat once you start, because the satiety signals that work for other people don't work for you. And you don't get full. You're eating, you don't get full. Your belly might be saying it's full, but your elbow still wants to bend, your mouth still wants to chew, and your brain is still saying more, more, more. And you don't ever get that sensation of aversion to food, like needing to stop eating that so many other people get. And then what happens is, as you lose control over how much you're eating, you watch yourself break your promises to yourself around food. And you're out of control in that moment. You don't mean to be doing it. It's, it's sort of like, it's like a strange mental blank spot. Suddenly find yourself eating more than you intended, but you really have promised yourself not to do that again. And now you're left psychologically having to reconcile that disconnect. And something called self-perception theory kicks in, which is the theory in psychology that says that we actually learn who we are by watching what we do. And we have to bridge the gap. If we're doing something, we have to have a story about why we're doing that. And the only thing we can ultimately end up concluding about ourselves is that we must not like ourselves. We must not be trustworthy to ourselves. We must not care about our well-being enough. And a very deep-seated psychological feeling of deep-seated psychological issues comes over you, where you start to feel like, I really am flawed deeply, deeply. I don't care enough about myself to do better by myself. I don't know why that is, but there's something deeply wrong with me. And I'm not going to be right with myself or with this world unless I sort out this food issue.
What's it like? Tell us about some of the specific spots where someone carrying excess weight encounters stigma in the society we live in.
Well, there was some powerful research decades ago, actually, that surveyed healthcare professionals, doctors, nurses, clinicians, healthcare workers, anonymously, and asked them how they thought and felt about people living with obesity. And over 90% of them agreed with statements like, I think they're dumb and I think they're lazy. I think they are slovenly and they don't care about their well-being. And so living with excess weight means you don't get good health care. It means you're not trusted when you report your symptoms. It means that, depending on the weight, right? So there's class 1, class 2, and class 3 and 4 obesity. I was living with class 1 obesity, which in this day and age is just normal. People look at my before pictures and they're like, it's not, not extreme morbid obesity. With extreme morbid obesity, you're stared at, you're teased, and a powerful isolation can develop. Not everybody experiences that. Some people who have a naturally winning personality, are able to develop friends and have a social life, but it's like sandbags around your ankles, having many, many friends who have lived and are still living with extreme morbid obesity, I know that, travel and mobility are a huge, huge issue. Airplane seats, bicycles are a non-starter, walking into a restaurant, you're afraid that they're going to seat you in a booth that you won't be able to fit in. Everywhere you go, you're afraid that if you sit down, you might break the chair because that's happened to you a few times and it's mortifying. So every chair before you sit, you're kind of looking at it. How strong is that chair? There was another study that asked kids to look at an array of line drawings of other kids. One was in a wheelchair. One had class 3 or 4 obesity, extreme morbid obesity. One had a large birthmark on their face. Anyway, there may be 5 pictures like that. And kids were asked, who do you most not want to be friends with? And almost all of them picked the kid with the heavy body. Almost all of them. Just showing that in our society today, weight is stigmatized above probably anything else.
Some of us think that if we judge something, we make it change. We criticize ourselves as a way to try to motivate ourselves to change behavior. And does that work with weight?
I don't think it works with anything. Interestingly, the ones that try to shame us and critique us into changing are usually a part of ourselves that we call the inner critic part, right? A lot of us wanted to change badly and maybe had an adult figure in our life that used to criticize us. A lot of us did. And we developed a protective part of ourselves that's trying to, it's trying to help us. It's trying to help us be happy and well and liked and thriving, right? But that part of ourselves inside of us shames us and criticizes us into trying to do better. And it's not an adaptive strategy. As a matter of fact, that shame spiral is what a lot of people eat over. The internal anxiety of it is so intense that the numbness that's produced by eating these addictive foods that flood the brain with dopamine and produce a euphoria and a release, very similar to a little bit of opium, using a lot of those same neurotransmitter receptors in the brain, they seek that relief with food to escape that criticism. So ironically, not only does it not work, it produces often the opposite effect and weight can go ever higher.
You just compared, again, hyperpalatable, hyperprocessed foods with drugs. And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about how the access dynamics and the social dynamics actually make our food system more addiction generative even than
for drugs.
Street drugs.
The foods that we have in our food supply today are literally, truly, actually physiologically addictive. So it's not that they're addictive like a metaphor, right? They're actually addictive. As a matter of fact, interestingly, I just learned this recently, the original studies that were done on the dopamine addiction curve in the nucleus accumbens, they were done in rodents, and the addictive substance they used in those studies was glucose. They didn't use cocaine. They didn't use opiates. They used glucose. That's what they did. They injected the rats with essentially flour, pure glucose, not mitigated by any fiber. So these drugs these drugs, these foods. So these foods work like drugs in the brain. They produce the same dopamine spike, not as high of a spike as crack cocaine, but as someone who was addicted to crack cocaine, what I want to say is when I quit crack cocaine, I had a world to return to, going to 12-step meetings, getting back with my family, enrolling in community college, getting a job at a movie theater. I had a world to enter into where literally nobody was suggesting or pushing crack cocaine in my direction. Nobody, right? But the person who's food addicted has nowhere to hide. They can't even drive from home to work without billboards and cues and logos bombarding them with the suggestion to now deviate back into their addiction, right? So it's not just the cues, it's not just the social pressure, it's also that you can't stop eating, so you've got to figure out how you're going to engage and interact with your drug every single day. Yes, you can stop eating sugar and flour and processed foods, but it turns out, unfortunately, that excess quantities of food are addictive, and that the line between, for example, sugar and not sugar is not always so clear, right? I was at a restaurant with you just last night where they brought a salad dressing that they said was just oil and vinegar, but it was a pomegranate balsamic that was ridiculously sweet to my taste buds. Well, is that sugar, right? The line is not always so clear. And the food circuits in our brain are so primitively wired. The getting and the eating of food was built into our brains on a moment-by-moment basis in a way that no other motivation or drive system was. So the food addiction systems have such a powerful part of the brain to hijack and accentuate. There's no other drug of abuse like it. It's the worst.
In that context, with all that's stacked against us, how do we get free?
Oh, how do we get free from food addiction? So the first step is to know where you stand, because food addiction is not a binary construct. It's a continuum. So if you think about it from 1 on the low end to 10 on the high end, I call it the food addiction susceptibility scale. And everyone has a brain that's more or less susceptible. I'm a 10 on that scale. Other people, like you, are a 1 or a 2 or a 3 on that scale. But let's say you discover that you're a 7 on that scale. And let's say you have, a good 20, 30, 40 pounds that you would like to lose, right? Well, now you're armed with a certain amount of information. You know that you have enough food addiction on board that run-of-the-mill efforts to eat the right foods aren't going to be enough. You're probably going to want to abstain from the foods that give you the most trouble completely. And so at that moment that you know you're a 7 on that scale, you can say, all right, I should really inventory the foods that give me the most trouble, and I should just deeply accept that one day at a time, I'm going to try to live without these foods. And what you'll find is that if you're firm about it, you'll feel freer, not more constrained immediately. You'll feel better in every way. So one of the things we really need to understand in our society is that someone who decides to quit smoking, quit drinking, not eat after 7 p.m. or after dinner, say, isn't being too hard on themselves or too extreme or unrealistic. They're making an empowered choice. It's liberating in certain ways. And abstaining from certain foods is also liberating. People who are vegetarian aren't boxing themselves into a terrible world that they're being unrealistic to try to live within. It's actually fine. And, people say you can't eliminate all food groups. And I say, since when did sugar become a food group? This is terrible.
So what do we need to abstain from if we want to have food freedom?
Well, for someone who is higher on the food addiction susceptibility scale, abstaining completely from sugar and flour is a great move. It's really, really freeing. And there are a few other foods in the mix there that aren't technically flour, but also should be 86th. And that's popcorn and chips. They're really addictive. They're right up there in the top 5 or 10 most addictive foods. And they're also molecularly very similar to flour. People seem to get sugar, but they don't understand flour. Why flour? And it turns out that glucose, unadulterated by fiber, is extremely addictive. As soon as it's a whole real food, it's not problematic. So I have no issues with wheat. Go eat your wheat just in the form of wheat berries, and whole real foods are all fine. And it's interesting. interestingly, in Bright Line Eating, we eat every whole real food. So when people say you're eliminating all food groups, I'm thinking, what food groups are they talking about?
I'm curious, when you think about bright lines, and obviously you started Bright Line Eating, can you tell us a bit about that concept? And when is it critical to have how sharp a line
Yes.
for people?
Bright lines are clear, unambiguous boundaries that you just don't cross. And we understand this concept intuitively, right? Someone who quits smoking puts a bright line between themselves and nicotine or cigarettes of any kind, right? People who quit drinking and go to AA, or maybe don't go to AA, but decide to not drink, have a bright line. When it comes to food, it's much harder because we need to eat. But if someone is profoundly addicted to food, they're going to need to have bright enough lines around their food that they know with every bite they take, whether it's on their plan or off their plan. The idea is that just like the alcoholic gets sober and then has the job one day at a time of not taking the first drink. They're not trying to not get drunk. They're trying to not take the first sip of the first drink. You need to know where that boundary is so that you can make it your job to never cross it. With food, the 4 bright lines that allow you to do that are sugar, flour, meals, so you only eat meals, never snacking or grazing. Meals, and then quantities, certain quantities of foods that you eat. Make them abundant enough that you can get from meal to meal. These need to be very voluminous meals. But once you've had your meal, you're not eating again until the next meal. So every bite of food, between breakfast and lunch or lunch and dinner would be a no thank you.
What about the social side of food? Tell us a bit about how social ties pull so many of us in the wrong direction in a toxic food culture, but also, is it important to have social support in moving on a healthier path?
The social pressures to eat are outrageous. In my own home, just the other day, I threw a little party and I had a bunch of people over, and it was a birthday party for my kiddo. Now, my kiddo doesn't do Bright Line Eating, doesn't need to abstain from sugar. She's just a kid, right? And she had made a beautiful cake. It's fancy layered cake. It was her birthday. I supported her doing that. It was amazing. And we were serving this cake, and several of the adults declined having a piece, right? Fair enough. Several of the adults had a tiny piece. Lots of people had a big piece. Everyone was at free choice. And someone said to one of the adults who wasn't eating any cake, started ribbing them. You got to live, this isn't the time, you're old enough. I think she said, you're old enough that, there's no point now and not, saying no. And I was in the kitchen and I was just thinking, really, in my house, you're going to do that? So the social pressures to eat are tremendous. I've been clean and sober from drugs and alcohol now for 29 years. And I have personally seen and felt the evolution of people's acceptance around not drinking as a lifestyle choice. Now, for me, it's a matter of life and death. But people take it with respect. Now, on New Year's Eve, when I say, no, thank you, I don't drink, when the champagne flutes are being passed around, people are very respectful. They back right off, and they often hustle to find me something else to drink, right? Usually I'm good. I got my sparkling water. When I say, no, thank you, I don't eat sugar on Thanksgiving as the pumpkin pie is being passed, it's usually a very different story. Now, in my immediate environment, people have learned that I really don't eat sugar and I don't need to be, prodded into it, that I'm still going to say no, thank you. But in most homes, someone's going to get really tortured by their friends and family, especially on special occasions, for turning down sweet treats. Yeah. And I think that that's something we really need to change. I would love to see a world in which when someone moves into the neighborhood, we would never bake some cookies and bring them over to them, because we would be thinking they might have a weight, challenge. They might have diabetes. They might have heart disease. They might be actively doing something to try to live healthier. And a plate of cookies might be exactly what they don't need at this moment. And why would I pressure them to eat something that's not in their best, healthiest, thriving, flourishing interests, right? Why don't I bring them a bouquet of beautiful, fresh flowers? Why don't I bring them a gorgeous potted plant? So that's what I think we need to be getting to in terms of our social world. Now, when it comes to social ties to stay eating the way we're eating, When you want to swim upstream from the standard American diet, when you want to not cave to the global industrial diet that now has 50% of people worldwide living with overweight or obesity, 50% across the whole world. Stunning. Did you know that we just crossed that? Yeah.
No.
So that was the World Health Organization or the UN or somebody just put out this report that now 50% of all people on planet Earth are living with clinical obesity or overweight. 70% in the developed world. Even in Norway, in the United States, it's 70%, but a lot of people with obesity. In Norway, it's still 70%, but just not as many with obesity yet, more with overweight. But they're getting there. They're closing that gap really fast. To not walk that path takes company. It takes friends because we are herd animals. And we have built-in circuits that run really, really deep that do not let us live in such a way as to ostracize ourselves from our community. Because literally that feels in the brain like a threat to our survival. So every little comment, no matter how subtle, of everyone around us, letting you know that you're not doing what they're doing, that, it's okay, but, whatever, that their hesitations, their estrangement, their lack of understanding erodes your conviction to eat the way you're eating. And the only antidote I've found to that is a feeling of belonging that's equally strong to a community of people who eat the way you eat, who are not eating the standard American diet. And when you belong to that community, the threat of losing that balances out what you experience out in the outside world. And the stronger you can make that community of people you're traveling with, eating in a wholesome, whole, real food kind of way, the better off you'll be and the more likely you will be to exist and persist long into the future of years and decades, eating in a healthful way.
There is a widespread belief that weight accumulation is essentially a product of a formula: calories consumed to calories burned. And in that belief system, you can exercise more and that earns your credits to eat more.
Right.
What's wrong with this picture?
You hear it all the time. Calories in, calories out. That all you got to do is eat less, exercise more. And so, if you exercised a bunch, that gives you credits where now you can eat more food, right? There are so many problems with that simplistic formulation, but in my view, the number one issue with it that I don't hear people talk about much is that what we eat today changes our brain and determines to a significant degree how we will orient toward food and how much we will need to eat tomorrow. That's the issue. So 100 calories of brown rice, tofu, and kale, and 100 calories of pound cake, right? Or Skittles, or popcorn and M&Ms at the movies, processed foods, are going to be entirely different in the way they change your physiology to set you up tomorrow as someone who's going to crave eating more than your body needs, or someone who's going to be satisfied eating only and exactly what your body needs and free mentally to go on to live a healthy, active life. Those two packets of food are going to be completely different in terms of whether they set you up to feel sluggish and sit on the couch, or whether they set you up to be active and to be willing to engage with life. So what we need to remember is that what we eat changes our brain and our bodies and creates an entirely new landscape for tomorrow.
So you're saying that eating more processed foods literally changes the way that our brains operate to want more calories.
Yeah.
Or is it more of those same things, those same processes?
It is both. It is both. So we are all wired with a brain that is a calorie density meter. Like all of our brains are really attuned to the foods that deliver the biggest bang for the buck, the biggest caloric hit for the lowest energy expenditure. And so it's no wonder that our collective weights are going up and up and up in a world with vending machines and convenience stores, right? But it gets more so and worse the more processed foods we eat. In just 2 weeks, in a metabolic ward study where they took cohorts of people and exposed some of them to a processed foods diet and some of them to a whole foods diet with calories and grams of protein, carbohydrate, and fat and sugar all kept equal, just processed versus unprocessed. The people eating the processed food didn't just gain a lot of weight, but they created brains and bodies that were predisposed to gain more weight after that. And so that's the issue, is the food changes your brain and your body.
There's a class of drugs that has recently been approved for weight loss that is becoming extremely popular. Can you tell us about it and how it works and its rise in popularity and what its pros and cons are?
Everybody is asking me these days about semaglutide drugs. So these drugs for weight loss, Wegovy was recently approved by the FDA for weight loss, but they're originally diabetes drugs, Ozempic, tirzepatide. These are diabetes drugs, and they work, they're GLP-1 agonists. So what that means is that they work on the insulin glucose system. So they work on the pancreas to produce more insulin. They work on the liver to produce less glucagon. So they balance out the blood sugar system. And it turns out that this GLP-1 agonist also goes right to the brainstem to produce effects that dampen the hypothalamic appetite, essentially. They're satiety enhancers. They're appetite killers, if you will. So people taking these drugs lose their appetite. They suddenly don't want to eat as much. They don't eat as much. They suddenly feel full way more easily. So they're not necessarily eating a bunch more healthy food. They're just eating a lot less overall. And so people are losing a significant amount of weight, 15 to 18% of their starting body weight. So it's not going to take someone, from extreme morbid obesity to thin on average, 15 to 18% of their starting body weight. But that is way more than what other weight loss interventions have delivered historically. Historically, 5 to 7% of starting body weight is all you get, and then you regain it after about 6 months. Now, bright line eating delivers 15 to 18% of starting body weight as well. So there is one behavioral intervention called bright line eating in the published literature, and I have to say I have a conflict of interest here because I founded Bright Line Eating and I published those studies. But those studies show that you can actually change how you eat and eat healthier foods and get the same results and keep the weight off for years, right? Published studies show that. But people like a pill. And these aren't pills, these are injectables. So it's an injection that you get once a week right now. I know they're working on pills feverishly. They're trying to create pills. There are downsides to these drugs, and there are upsides too. I think that the weight loss is not a trivial thing. People are really wanting to lose weight. There are good reasons for losing weight, for your joints and your mood and your self-esteem and your confidence and your sex drive and your heart and your lungs, and pretty much every system in the body is healthier when you get that weight off. And these drugs have shown to have some cardiovascular benefits as well. But there are side effects. Some of which are quite severe. So the FDA has put a big black box warning on them. That's the highest level of warning around thyroid cancer. So that's one potential issue. And another issue with them is terrible gastrointestinal side effects. Nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, intestinal blockages, sharp intestinal pain, side effects that are so bad that a lot of people are unable to continue on with the drugs. For other people who do continue on, some of the side effects start to lessen after about a month on the drugs. But the drugs are doing something to the small intestine, and we don't have any safety studies beyond 2 years. So the longest safety trials in the weight loss world were like 1.5 years, and the longest trials with diabetes were 2 years. So we don't know what happens long-term with these drugs. And the biggest issue that I see is that research is very clear on this. Once you stop taking the drug, what happens is you gain all the weight back. You gain all the weight back. So if you're going to take a semaglutide drug for weight loss, you need to really ask yourself, am I willing to be on this drug forever? Because that's what it would take to solve this problem. Now, here's the interesting thing about semaglutide drugs. Not only are they dampening appetite, but people are also stopping their addictive behaviors. They're drinking less alcohol, they're smoking fewer cigarettes, and their food cravings are diminished. And the hunger system is separate in the brain from the cravings system, but the craving system is also being affected. We don't yet know how. This is actually a mystery as of right now. We don't know what it is, either a separate action or downstream from the GLP-1 effect on the insulin system that is causing some sort of quieting of the dopaminergic reward systems in the brain, which is really interesting. The drugs are super controversial and they're very, very profitable. So the Danish company that manufactures Wegovy and Ozempic has become the most valuable company in all of Europe, $425 billion. So people are buying these drugs like gangbusters, and I guess we will see what they do to people's health long term.
And the cost of them to the consumer, if someone is, or to an insurance company, is pretty high as well, right?
Yeah, it's like $15,000 a year right now. And so people are literally taking out second mortgages to get these drugs. They're extremely expensive right now.
And for life, or else the weight comes right back.
That's right.
Typically, it's perceived and experienced by most people that weight gain is a one-way street. That people may lose a bit or even a lot, but the brain somehow resets to whatever your highest weight has been and establishes that as a new normal. Can you talk about this dynamic?
Weight gain is incredibly pernicious because the brain seems to remember the highest weight that you've been at before and set that as a set point. We call it a set point. And the brain is fine with you gaining weight. It doesn't mind that at all. It allows you to gain weight, as much weight as you want to gain. It is extremely skittish, though, about you losing weight. It somehow believes that if you have weighed 300 pounds and you lose weight to 250 pounds, you must now be 50 pounds underweight, and you must be starving, and you must need to eat and eat and eat and eat to regain that weight. And the brain launches a full-on hormonal assault to force you to regain that weight. It lessens your satiety hormones. It increases your hunger hormones. It turns down your metabolism hormones. And suddenly you find yourself eating your way right back up to your former weight. So this is a real pickle. It makes it very, very hard to lose weight. There are some things that have been proven scientifically to allow the brain to relax and allow what we call the adiposity set point to lower back down. One of them is eating enough protein, a fair bit of protein. Another one is exercise. And the one that is the most powerful in the literature is the simplicity of your food. So fewer ingredients, fewer condiments, simpler preparations. Just think, green beans, broccoli, tofu. Grilled tofu, like just simple foods on a plate, simple food. So like I say, not sexy food. You want to keep your food not sexy. Very simple.
I'm curious about the literature that you've published, the research that you've done with Bright Line Eating. Can you tell us about the studies you've conducted and what you've learned?
Well, for the last 9 years since I started Bright Line Eating, I've been helping people to lose their weight and get more freedom from food obsession and from food cravings. But I've also been collecting data on the results and publishing the data in peer-reviewed studies, presenting them at peer-reviewed scientific conferences. And some of the studies that we've published have been truly remarkable. For one thing, the weight loss has been stellar, several times more than what you see with Noom or Weight Watchers or any other published data from commercial weight loss programs. And in fact, levels of weight loss that are comparable to semaglutide drugs, these weight loss drugs where people lose, enormous amounts of weight really fast. People lose that with Bright Line Eating. So really stellar weight loss results. And they maintain the weight loss for years. So that's obviously good too. One of the studies that I like the best, we looked at over 4,000 people, so not a small cohort, from every age range, from people in their 20s all the way to people in their 70s and 80s. And what we found was that when they do Bright Line Eating, their rate of weight loss is equivalent. Now, this is remarkable, especially if you're in menopause and you're experiencing that it's way harder to lose weight than it used to be, you might say, well, that clearly can't be right, because it's harder to lose weight when you're over 50, say, over 60. And generally speaking, it is, because both women and men lose a lot of estrogen as they age, and estrogen levels go way down, and estrogen has a facilitating effect on insulin, which is a fat storage and fat release hormone. So it's harder to lose weight after you don't have estrogen in your system. But interestingly, if you're not eating processed foods anymore, if you're not eating sugar and flour, which is what people do with bright line eating, they stop eating those foods. Now, all of a sudden, you're not relying on estrogen to help your insulin manage all of the spikes and crashes from crappy eating, right? And so that levels the playing field, and people lose weight equivalently. So they lose weight fast and easily, no matter their age. So that's really cool. We did another study that looked at COVID and how people did with their psychosocial metrics doing bright line eating before, during, and after the peak of COVID. The peak I'm talking about is like April, May, and June of 2020. So we looked at what happened to people's happiness levels, their levels of depression, their days of poor mental health, their feeling of social connection, their feeling of being loved and supported and connected in the world, their happiness, their energy levels, and their well-being. So we looked at all of these metrics. And what we found was that before and after COVID, people experienced profound increases in their well-being in every way. Their energy went up, their depression went down, their days of poor mental health went down, their flourishing went up, their social support of love and connection went up. Better in every way by significant margins, like really large effects. And we were surprised to find that during the peak of COVID, so April, May, June of 2020, the effect was bigger in a significant way beyond that, showing that bright line eating improves people's resilience, and that being connected with a social support group around healthy eating provides a buffer against the most intense stressors of life.
So one could say that a lot of people use food to deal with stress, to numb, to feel less impacted by pains. It's well known that many people who've been through traumas, that can be one of the impetuses that can lead to later weight gain in life. It's almost like we're trying to create insulation and protection from the world. But it sounds like you're saying that there are other strategies for accomplishing those same goals that are actually healthier.
Absolutely. Yeah, we use food for so many things. Absolutely, people are using food to numb and to kind of eat their way through life, as it were. I think this is why a lot of very successful people eat and struggle with their weight. And they may have family members who turn to drugs or alcohol. They think of themselves as not the addict in the family, but actually they're eating their way through their life. And they're performing at a very high level because food will allow you to do that. You can juice up with caffeine and sugar and get through lots of really challenging things and perform at a pretty high level. But also not just your body takes the toll, but also your psychology, your emotional regulation system. And so what I find is that food is a poor proxy for support. It's a poor proxy for coping. And as soon as you stop using food to cope, you now have an opportunity to develop some really adaptive coping skills, to learn what really would support you in life. And you have an opportunity to address the traumas underneath that you've been using food to nurture yourself through, because food is a poor proxy for nurturance as well.
You actually, in your work, have developed whole programs for people who are no longer using food to cope with life's stresses and challenges, and now they need some new tools.
Yes, absolutely. This is what I do for a living in my life's work, is I help people address life without using food to cope. And one of the tools I find most helpful is internal family systems. So this is parts work. This is work where you understand the parts of you that have used food to cope, and you do some work with those parts to work together to figure out, well, what could we do now? What does true nurturance look like? What does true comfort look like? What does true celebration look like? What does true connection and support look like? And suddenly you find yourself up-leveling in every way, because not only do you feel better that you're eating more nourishing food, you're not eating junk food anymore, your weight is slimming down, you're healthier, you're happier, you're more vibrant, but you're also feeling proud of yourself that you're using better tools for meeting life's challenges. It feels wonderful.
I'm having chills as you're talking about that, because I'm thinking about how often we develop the best strategies we can come up with for dealing with what life brings us. And for all of us, life brings more than its share of heartache and pain. And yet sometimes those tools and strategies were developed at a time in life when it was the best we could get a hold of at the time. But maybe we can do better now with all the resources, because we've grown up some and we've learned some and we've evolved some. Maybe we can actually do better now. And it sounds like you're actually helping folks with food freedom to develop whole new toolkits for how to manage the stresses of life in ways that are more complementary to their real values and wholeness.
Absolutely. If you think of a little kid in an abusive or a conflict-ridden or a lonely and isolated home environment, it may well be that access to comforting food, to baked goods, to sugar cereals, to, big bowls of spaghetti and mac and cheese, right? It was maybe all they had access to comfort and nurture themselves. There might not have been an adult or a person that was trustworthy, that was present consistently, and absolutely an adaptive strategy to get through a difficult childhood would be food. That wasn't my experience. I had loving parents, but they were single parents. My parents were divorced and I was an only child, and they had to work really hard. My dad was a cab driver, and my mom ran this shop in Fisherman's Wharf that had to stay open very long hours, and we didn't have money for babysitters, and I was alone a lot. And so food for me was entertainment, it was comfort, it was what there was to do, and it filled a big role in my life. And when I stopped using food in that way, I had to learn how to face life and fill it up with things other than food.
I want to talk with you a little bit about hormones and the role of hormones in regulating satiety and in relationship with food. How do our hormones affect our relationship to food, and how does our food affect those hormones?
So when it comes to hormones, one of the hormones that affects our relationship with food the most is leptin. So leptin is the hormone that's keeping all those mammals you see out there in the world, the dogs and the cats and the deer and the chipmunks who aren't at an amusement park, at a normal weight, right? You don't see fat deer. You just don't. And you don't because they have leptin that's working properly. So leptin is the hormone that gets released by fat cells when they get plumper, when they get filled with more adipose tissue, right? Those fat cells expand and they release leptin out into the bloodstream that then circulates back to the brain that says, we have enough fuel on board. Now's the time to use that fuel to go maybe find new sources of food further afield, maybe go build a hut or kill a wildebeest or do something adaptive, productive, build a nest, find more nuts, go do something with that fuel. So literally it says, stop eating, get active. Well, we all want that hormone, right? It's the stop eating and get active hormone. And what's happening in our society today is not that we don't have enough leptin. When the pharmaceutical companies discovered leptin in 1994, they literally invested millions trying to figure out ways to put leptin into pills. They did that, but it had no effect, because it turns out we have tons of leptin, and the heavier we are, the more leptin we have. The problem is the brain can't see it. It's called leptin resistance, and this is what's keeping our brains content with us being as heavy as we are. And the biggest driver of leptin resistance is insulin. So Insulin is the hormone that's a fat storage and fat release hormone. And when it's not working properly and your cells are becoming insensitive to it, you just have more and more of it at baseline, not just because you've eaten a cookie, but more and more at baseline. And all of that circulating insulin is blocking the leptin. And now suddenly your brain thinks you're starving. Even if you're 400 pounds, your brain literally thinks you're starving and that you've got to eat more to survive. Leptin resistance is what causes insatiable hunger. People who eat a whole huge dinner and then they go eat a bag of chips in front of the TV. And then after the bag of chips is gone, they need a pint of ice cream and finish that off. And they're still thinking they need to eat more food. They literally never feel full to the point of like, I'm going to stop eating now. They could just keep eating.
Can you explain to us more specifically about how it is that insulin resistance is correlated or linked with leptin resistance in the human body? What's the relationship between these two compounds?
So the relationship between insulin and leptin is that high insulin levels block leptin at the brainstem and at the hypothalamus. So it's not just insulin that does it, it's also high inflammation and high triglycerides. But it's the eating of sugar and flour and processed foods that's driving all of that. And what's happening is as we eat more processed foods, our insulin goes up and up and up. We become more insulin resistant, and the excess insulin circulating in our system is blocking leptin at a molecular level in the brainstem and at the hypothalamus. And so your brain's just not seeing the leptin anymore, and it thinks you're starving. Even if you're 400 pounds, it's convinced you're starving.
What is the microbiome's role in all of this? Is it the case that the microbiome changes in response to hyperprocessed foods or sugars? And does that in turn affect our relationship to appetite or what types of foods we want and also our health outcome?
The microbiome is hugely impactful in the foods that we eat. As we eat more sugar, more flour, more processed foods, our microbiome changes from, I guess you could call them good gut bacteria to bad gut bacteria. And the bad gut bacteria thrive on eating sugar, and they demand that you eat more sugar. And of course, the gut doesn't just have these bacteria, it also has a nervous system, right? Most of our serotonin, most of our dopamine is not in our brain, it's in our gut. And so the gut has its own brain, its own way of thinking and of driving you to eat more of the foods to support the bacteria that are needing now that source of fuel. Interestingly, artificial sweeteners cause this as much or more than sugar. So eating artificial sweeteners as a substitute for real sugar drives body fatness even in excess of eating sugar. So I'm going to tell you about a study here where they had 3 groups of mice. They were all fed 3 meals a day, but during that hour of the meal, they could eat an unlimited amount of food, but just 3 meals a day. And in between times, they had a beverage. One was water, one was sugar water, and one was artificially sweetened water. And at the end of the trial of the study, the artificially sweetened water mice were the fattest. Wow. Yeah, even they weren't actually getting calories from that artificially sweetened water, and they were the fattest. And so research in animals shows that eating artificial sweeteners today drives profound overconsumption of food and especially sugar tomorrow. So this again is what I talk about, where it's not calories in, calories out, because the food you eat today drives what you're going to be eating and how much of it tomorrow.
Does it seem like it sort of tricks the brain? Like the brain's like, oh, I'm going to get food, and then it doesn't. It feels cheated, and then it wants to fill that gap?
That's exactly what happens. So what happens when you eat artificial sweeteners is the taste buds communicate with the brain, oh good, there's a big bolus of really high calorie density food coming. Stomach, be ready. Release all the gastro juices that you need to release to digest all of this great food that's coming. And then this big bolus of fake nothing arrives in the stomach, and the stomach goes, you were wrong. Nothing happened here. We got bupkis. Thanks a lot. And over time, it literally breaks the communication system where the stomach does not believe the tongue anymore.
And the brain's like, we'll make it up to you. Let's get some more. I'm so sorry.
Exactly. Yeah. So artificial sweeteners literally make you eat more food downstream. And they also are part of what's responsible for breaking the connection between the brain and the stomach.
Literally eroding that trust because we've tricked the brain.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. There's no free lunch.
Yeah. So is this even true of like stevia?
Yeah, I'm sorry. It is. So the challenge with stevia, so it has that issue of like the taste of something that should be highly caloric, but it's not. So inherent in that is the issue. But also what you got to remember with stevia or any other types of artificial sweeteners that are supposed to be better or whatever, monk fruit, whatever have you, is that the sweet taste buds on the tongue have direct connections to the addiction centers in the brain. So any degree of addictive yearning that you have for more hyperpalatable foods is going to be kept alive by those sweeteners.
So in Bright Line Eating, you focus a lot on sugar and flour, essentially, and processed foods more broadly. In Food Revolution Network, we also talk a lot about animals and plants and the plant-based diet. Can you talk a little bit about the Bright Line Eating relationship to animal product consumption? Obviously, bacon can technically be considered a food, no?
Bacon's not on the Bright Line Eating plan.
Bacon's not on there. So tell us, though, how does your community relate to the plant-based movement?
So first of all, in Bright Line Eating, we eat tons and tons and tons of plants, right? So that's the main thing, is that it's a plant-strong diet, even for people who choose to eat some meat in it as well. It's mounds of vegetables at both lunch and dinner, and a large amount of fruit and grain, and some protein at breakfast. Now, when I lay out the Bright Line Eating food plan, we think in terms of categories of food, categories like protein, fat, fruit, vegetable, grain. Those are the 5 categories: protein, fat, fruit, vegetable, grain. And it's very heavy on the vegetables. But as you notice, 4 out of those 5 categories are inherently plants, right? And one of them is protein. And I break down the protein tables in Bright Line Eating to be plant-based options and omnivore options, so that someone who's plant-based doesn't even need to see the omnivore option table and can just look at the plant-based table. Now, I know that those categories are artificial in the sense that, for example, kale and broccoli are half protein by calorie, right? But it's helpful from a psychological perspective there's method to that madness. It really is helpful to think of it in terms of those categories. But we're very plant-strong friendly and very vegan friendly at Bright Line Eating. And you at the Food Revolution Network have been such a supporter of Bright Line Eating that it's always seemed like over half of our population is plant-based eaters. And what that does is it has the effect of bringing in people who currently eat the standard American diet. And first, they're like, okay, I'll give up sugar and flour. I hate that idea, but I will. And then as they get more autonomy and authorship over their food choices and their freedom starts to be returned to have agency to choose healthier options, a lot of them start migrating more plant-based. We see these posts every day. All right, I'm thinking about being plant-based this month or this week, or, somebody tell me how they cook beans in their Instant Pot. And we have those questions all the time in our community. So we start to win people over. I think that giving up sugar, flour, and all animal products at the beginning would be probably too high a bar for almost everybody that we're trying to attract. And so we see our job as helping people regain their authorship over their food and shed their food addictions and handle their weight issues as well. And then we're very happy when we see them start to eat, not just more plants, but potentially less meat as well, maybe none.
Once they're the author of their food lives, they get to ask, what does my integrity look like?
That's right.
And they get to have questions about, as you talked about earlier, how to meet the real needs we have in our lives, for meaning, for value, for impact, for wellness, when we're freed from addiction.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, and there's a lot of influences in our community around health and around the food revolution. Our missions have been tightly aligned from the beginning. And so we influence each other a lot. And we're very happy to support the Food Revolution Network's mission wholeheartedly every year.
A lot of people make big changes and get big results, lose a ton of weight, feel better, and then slip. In a toxic food culture, it's so easy to do. That brain that's reset and thinking I should be 300 pounds and I'm starving to death if I'm not, can kick back in. And even when we know what's at stake, even when we know how powerful food is, the addictive impulses are so powerful, and they sometimes catch us when we're down or when we're not expecting it, and suddenly we're right back where we started or worse.
Yeah.
And so a lot of your focus is on resuming. You actually wrote a book about this, how to kind of get back on the horse when you fall off. Can you talk about those dynamics and what's at stake here and what's at play?
I think one of the reasons that food is the hardest addiction to kick, or food habits are the hardest to change, is that relapse is so common and likely with food, because we're bombarded on every side with encouragement to eat foods that are not going to be in our best interests, right? And so at a weak moment, you have a little, and then if you have a brain that kicks in the what the hell effect, which is the psychological term for, well, I ate a piece of pizza, I might as well eat whatever I want, and I'll start again on Monday. Unfortunately, our society really rewards that kind of thinking. You can just find yourself back in the ditch. And it can be very demoralizing. So we focus a lot on resuming in the work that I do. I did write a book about this. It's called Resume. And we talk about the 4 S's. So there's a very concrete way of thinking about resuming. First is speed. So get back on track fast, not on Monday, but with the next bite, the next meal. 2 is social support. There's a lot of shame and isolation that can come over us when we are eating, again, and that urge to eat comfort foods really does go with an urge to be alone from others and to isolate ourselves. So actively forcing ourselves to seek social support can be really helpful. The 3rd S is seeking the lesson. So it could be, for example, that we need to take the quiz, find out where our brains are on the food addiction susceptibility scale. And it could be that we haven't been working a program or getting enough support for the reality of how our brain is wired when it comes to food. We might need to be in closer community with people who are doing bright line eating, for example. So seeking the lesson of what happened, it could be something as simple as we left the house without our lunch. And so at a moment when we were stressed and short on time, we found ourselves eating something that we didn't intend to eat, and it went south from there, right? And so the lesson really could be at night, as you're cooking dinner, throw some extra food into a Tupperware container for lunch the next day, right? So to really inventory the situation and look at what happened. And then the 4th S is self-compassion. We're so hard on ourselves. And our perfectionistic tendencies, that food controller part that tries to keep our food in order, it's often a perfectionist. The average person who goes from being a smoker to a non-smoker tries 31 times to quit smoking before it takes. That's average. Wow. So food is that hard and harder. So we need to have enormous amounts of self-compassion and understand that backsliding a bit is irrelevant in the context of a big life journey with food, and we just need to get back on track. So the best way to think of this is that old Buddhist parable or saying, fall down 7 times, get up 8.
It's an interesting tension point, because we also don't want to normalize falling down. The point of a bright line is also that, like, an alcoholic shouldn't have just one drink, right? We need to have that crispness. And when we fall, compassion. It reminds me kind of a serenity prayer, in a sense, that we ask for the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, and the courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And we can't change what's happened in the past. Right? One of the things we can never do, anytime we've fallen, you can never go back and undo that. But we can change what we do in the present, and we can accept the past, and we can bring love and compassion there. So once we fall, I just love that compassionate piece. And I also just want to support that rigor to also stay with it, because that also really matters.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
I want to speak for a moment to the 9s and 10s. I was talking about the food addiction susceptibility scale from 1 to 10. And the 9s and 10s on that scale, people with true clinical food addiction will be well served to aim to never break their bright lines. And there is a paradox there, that aim can have perfectionistic tendrils woven into it, but that doesn't mean that it's foolhardy. It's actually the right aim for the alcoholic to never take a drink, to at least aim in that direction. And what we see in Bright Line Eating is scads of people who come in, take the program to heart, are so willing and beaten down by the food when they come in that they stay bright and they stay close to the community. They heed my warnings, don't get complacent, and they stay bright one day at a time from then on. It really is doable, but it takes a lot of support and it takes a lot of willingness to really work it one day at a time.
What do you say to people who are dealing with histories of anorexia and fear of food and self-starving? How does that interplay with the work that you do?
So anorexia is a very interesting disease. First of all, it's extremely serious. It is the mental disorder with the highest mortality rate of all of the conditions, including schizophrenia or dissociative identity disorder. It's profoundly difficult to treat. And new research shows that 57% of people with anorexia who have the restriction-only type test also as having food addiction. And 76% of people with anorexia who have the binge-purge subtype also have food addiction, which means most people with anorexia are also suffering from food addiction. And this plays into the reality that of all the BMI statuses, normal weight, overweight, obesity class 1, obesity class 2, obesity class 3, the two that are most correlated with food addiction are obesity class 3 and being underweight. You're more likely to have food addiction if you're underweight than if you have class 1 obesity. So what I want to say about that is that anorexia is most often, a condition of food addiction that's just flipped upside down a little bit, where the reward value is not in eating, it's in not eating. So a typical person, when they haven't eaten for a while, their anxiety builds. And eating produces a flood of calm, hormones and neurotransmitters that flood the body with a peaceful, easeful feeling. Getting food, if you've been starved of food for a while, is a relief to the brain and to the body. When you have anorexia, it's the reverse. When you haven't eaten for a while, you feel better and better and better, and eating produces anxiety. And so it's not eating that is the rewarding, addictive cycle. But it's still an addictive cycle. And so what I'm hoping for is the food addiction community to partner more closely with the eating disorders treatment world and vice versa, so that we can have a world where people who have bulimia, binge eating disorder, and anorexia are actually getting treatment for their whole condition at the same time, which includes the food addiction component of it. Right now, we have people with bulimia and anorexia who are forced to eat cookies and muffins and cupcakes and candies as part of their treatment in rehab, and they're punished by rewards and privileges being revoked from them if they won't eat their cupcake. And for a lot of the people with bulimia, eating that cupcake sends them on another binge. And honestly, the prognosis and the efficacy of those treatment approaches is terrible. It's very low. And so I think a lot of that is because an understanding of food addiction is not woven into those treatment protocols.
Have you seen anything work with anorexia?
I have, in the sense that I have seen people with anorexia recover. It takes vigilance. It takes a desire to get better. It takes, it's a long-term recovery path. Yeah, I have. I've seen people. And I've seen people with restrictive eating and with a history of anorexia do well in bright line eating, but they have to do their work around the food restrictor part of them, right? That will see bright lines as inherently familiar to the food rules that they used to have with their anorexia. And the key is that they have to make sure that they're eating all their food with bright line eating. Bright line eating is not an eat very little food plan. It's an eat a lot of food plan, right. And which can be hard for someone with a history of anorexia.
And it's eat intentional and chosen food.
Yes.
So it could actually be used to gain weight if somebody's underweight, right? If they say, I'm going to eat this amount every single day and I'm going to do it.
Yeah, you can actually use bright line eating to deliberately gain weight. People who are working out or people who feel unhappy with how slender and svelte and skinny their body is, who want to pack on weight, who maybe forget to eat sometimes, or just find themselves having a hard time with the structure and the discipline to eat enough calories of good, healthy food, can absolutely use Bright Line Eating and weigh and measure, have a solid food plan of categories of food, and it will provide the structure that will allow them to gain the weight that they want to gain, for sure.
Tell us about your newest book and why you wrote it and what it means to you.
So my newest book is called On This Bright Day, A Year of Reflections for Lasting Food Freedom. And this book is for anyone who is not eating the standard American diet and who wants a daily source of nourishment and wisdom and inspiration and aspiration to reinforce their conviction that they're nourishing themselves with food and they're not eating sugar and flour and yucky, crappy junk food, that they're banded together with a community of people around the world who are committed to eating whole, real, healthy foods. And it really talks about what we do after the food and the weight are not an issue anymore, and we're living life in a more empowered, fulfilling, thriving way. And so it's one page of support every single day. It starts with a quote at the top, and then several paragraphs on a topic, and then a mantra at the bottom. And it's a beautiful book. I feel very proud of it.
Because we're eating every day, because we're living every day, there's something about having that routine of returning again and again to purposefulness and peace and contemplation around that relationship. In a toxic food culture, it's so common to just be unconscious about food. And this is about bringing consciousness as a routine, as a steady, consistent drumbeat to our lives. And that just sounds really beautiful. Not just willpower to try to fight, but peace and ease to center in the possibility.
What people struggle most with is consistency over the long term when it comes to eating. Oftentimes, we change our eating dramatically and quickly and then fall off the wagon, a time later and fall back to old habits. Our environment, our toxic food environment really supports that. Backsliding is very easy in our culture. And so On This Bright Day supports people to have some steady nourishment every day to reinforce their identity of someone who is being intentional with the way that they eat.
Last question, Susan. Why do we need a food revolution?
We need a food revolution because people are so desperate for one. We are drowning in excess food, in confusion around body weight and what it means. Yes, we need to eliminate stigma and prejudice and discrimination. But no, it is not okay that we're living in a world where our collective weight just keeps going up unabated and unchecked with no end in sight. So we need a food revolution because it's not healthy for us. And our planet is dying with the way that we're growing food, and our minds and bodies are saddled with torturous side effects of the food that we're eating. 63% of people are dying too young and in pain from conditions that have direct links to the food that we're putting in our mouths. And so a food revolution is going to relieve so much suffering and help us all be healthier and more well and more connected and more vital and more vibrant. And I'm so proud to be part of the food revolution with you, Ocean.
Yes to that. I'm proud to be part of this revolution with you as well, Susan. We've been talking with Dr. Susan Peirce-Thompson, author of Bright Line Eating, founder of Bright Line Eating, also founder and president of the Institute for Sustainable Weight Loss, and a leader in understanding the neuropsychology of food addiction, and food freedom. And Susan, thank you so much for your brilliant work, for giving hope to so many people who've lost it, for showing a clear path forward that we can follow that consistently and predictably delivers results. It's been so wonderful to share this work with you over all the years we've known and worked together. And so I'm so grateful for your partnership in this summit and in this food revolution.
Thank you so much, dear Ocean. I so appreciate our time together today. It's been wonderful.